The year is 1473 before Christ. On the west bank of the Nile, near the city the Greeks would later call Thebes, the dawn light does not gently appear, it bleeds. It bleeds across the vast, silent desert, turning the endless sea of sand a sinister, coppery color, the color of old blood dried on a sacrificial stone. In this unforgiving landscape, a woman named Hennet Mir stands utterly still, her bare feet planted on a limestone slab already hot enough to raise blisters. She does not shift her weight, the pain in her feet is a distant, trivial thing compared to the storm raging in her heart. Her hands are bound cruelly behind her back with coarse papyrus rope, tied so tightly that the fibrous strands have embedded themselves into her swollen, purpling flesh, a preview of the permanent marks to come. Around her neck, heavy and rough-hewn, hangs a wooden placard. Painted upon it are hieroglyphics that spell out her crime for all to see, adulteress. But in the ancient Egyptian tongue, this word carries a metaphysical weight that transcends any simple translation. It means betrayer of Ma'at, the sacred cosmic order that holds the stars in their courses and prevents the universe from collapsing back into primordial chaos. It means polluter of bloodlines, the very lineages that connect the living pharaoh to the gods themselves. In the eyes of the law, and the gods, her existence has become a crack in the foundation of reality, a threat that must be sealed with her suffering. Beneath a reed canopy that provides a stark island of shade, 3 judges sit in impassive judgment. Their faces are hidden behind magnificent, terrifying ceremonial masks of Anubis, the jackal-headed god who weighs the hearts of the dead against the feather of truth. They have already spoken the words that have unraveled her life. What will happen next is not merely punishment, it is a ritual of purification through agony, a restoration of cosmic balance achieved through the systematic, deliberate destruction of the body that dared to disrupt it. Who was she, before this moment? Hennet Mir was 22 years old. For 6 years, she was the wife of a mid-level scribe named Jyoti, a man she learned to share a life with. She is a mother to 3 children, a boy and 2 girls, whose laughter once filled her home. 2 days ago, those children were taken from her house. They were told their mother had died suddenly of a fever. As far as the implacable machinery of Egyptian law is concerned, this is true. The moment the accusation was formally proven, she ceased to be a person with rights, an identity, or a future. She was transformed into a vessel for a terrible demonstration, a living lesson carved in flesh, about what happens when women forget that their bodies are not their own, but belong to their husbands, their families, and ultimately, to the pharaoh himself, the guardian of Ma'at on earth. The first official punishment is called the breaking of the nose. Let there be no misunderstanding, this is not a metaphor for shame. It is a physical, brutal act of demolition. A specialized priest, a man trained for this specific duty, approaches. He carries a pair of heavy bronze tongs, their jaws heated in a nearby brazier until they glow a dull, ominous cherry red. The purpose is calculated and cruel, not immediate death, but permanent, inescapable marking. In a culture where the afterlife is a tangible reality, and where the soul's return requires a body as intact as possible for its eternal journey, this deliberate mutilation carries implications that thunder across the centuries. What they are about to do will not only scar her in this life, it will follow her, a disfigurement of her very essence, into eternity itself. A low, animal moan escapes her lips. She instinctively tries to turn her head away, to hide her face, the most personal of human landscapes. It is a futile gesture. 3 temple guards, their bodies hardened by training, close in. Their hands, impersonal and strong, grip her shoulders, her arms, her head, holding her completely immobile against the limestone block. She is trapped, a specimen pinned for examination and alteration. The priest raises the tongs and speaks a short, guttural ritual formula, asking the sun god Ammonius Ra to witness that this act of violence serves the higher purpose of divine justice. There is no pause for breath, no moment of mercy. He clamps the searing metal onto the bridge of her nose. The sound is a sickening combination of a sizzle and a crunch. With a powerful, twisting motion, he tears cartilage from bone. Witnesses standing in the square will later describe the sound to their families, whispering that it was similar to the ripping of thick papyrus, but wetter, more visceral. For Hennet Mir, the world explodes into a supernova of white-hot pain. But as the initial shock recedes, a colder, more terrifying understanding washes over her. This searing agony is not the worst part. The worst part is the crystal-clear knowledge that this is only the prelude. The judges have assigned her to serve 15 days of purification through suffering before her final disposition is even decided. 15 days. 360 hours during which her body will be systematically broken and altered, transformed into a living, breathing warning to every woman in Thebes who might ever consider, even for a moment, that her own desires could matter more than her duty to family, husband, and state. The journey into darkness has only just begun, and the path ahead is lined with instruments she cannot yet imagine. Here is the history you were never taught, the chapter carefully omitted from the grand narrative of ancient Egypt. You know the celebrated stories: Cleopatra, the cunning queen who held Rome in her thrall; Nefertiti, the powerful beauty whose name means the beautiful one has come. You have marveled at the elaborate beauty rituals, the perfectly kohl-lined eyes meant to ward off evil, the intricate golden jewelry gleaming in museum cases. You have walked through exhibits that rightfully celebrate this civilization's staggering sophistication, its advances in medicine, its precision in mathematics, its awe-inspiring engineering that raised pyramids to the sky. But you have never learned about the parallel system, the one dedicated to the systematic, ritualized brutality reserved for wives accused of adultery. You have never discovered the existence of the specialized priests, men who held a sacred office whose sole function was administering punishments so severe, so creatively cruel, that Roman historians arriving 1,000 years later would read the Egyptian records and dismiss them as exaggeration, unable to reconcile such barbarity with the civilization they admired. You have never heard the details of the legal framework that legally transformed a woman's body from a person into property, an asset to be damaged, disfigured, or destroyed at her husband's discretion, all under the cold, unblinking eye of the state. Tonight, we pull back the gilded curtain. You will learn why the famed Egyptian medical papyri, like the Ebers papyrus, contain such detailed, clinical instructions for treating injuries specifically inflicted during adultery punishments. You will see how physicians were explicitly instructed to keep victims alive through their suffering, preventing the merciful release of death, but were forbidden from administering treatments that would allow for complete healing. You will discover how accusations of adultery functioned as the ultimate political weapon, a tool to destroy inconvenient women, with conviction rates astonishingly above 98%, a statistic that reveals a system designed for condemnation, not justice. We will explore the archaeological evidence, the specialized punishment chambers built deep beneath the temples, carved directly into the bedrock, their architecture a silent scream of their purpose. And we will ask the haunting question: why did some women, according to burial records, choose to take their own lives in the weeks before their final punishments were scheduled? This is not just a history of laws, it is a testament to the human spirit in the face of institutionalized terror. The entire system was built upon a foundation of divine fear, the concept of Ma'at. This was the cosmic order, the principle of truth, balance, and harmony that held the universe together. Any action that disrupted Ma'at was a threat to all creation. Female adultery was classified not as a personal betrayal, but as one of the very worst violations, legally and theologically comparable to robbing a royal tomb or committing patricide. Why? Because it introduced the poison of uncertainty into the sacred, divinely ordained bloodlines that connected the living pharaoh to his divine ancestors. It was a crime against the state, against the gods, against reality itself. But here is what makes Egyptian adultery law particularly insidious and effective. The legal codes, compiled over centuries, specified different categories of adultery based not on love or intent, but on cold, social calculus. A noblewoman who coupled with a slave committed a far worse offense than a slave woman with a free man, because the violation of the social hierarchy compounded the sexual transgression. The most serious offense of all was any woman coupling with a priest, for this polluted not just family bloodlines, but the sacred intermediaries between humanity and the gods themselves. The threshold for evidence in these cases could be shockingly, terrifyingly minimal. Surviving legal papyri document numerous cases where convictions were secured based on nothing more substantial than a neighbor's testimony that they had seen a woman speaking too freely with a man who was not her husband. No physical evidence was required. The testimony of two male witnesses, whose status gave their words inherent weight, was sufficient to seal a woman's fate. Meanwhile, the woman's own testimony, her pleas, her version of events, carried essentially no legal weight in adultery proceedings. She could not testify in her own defense. She could not call witnesses to vouch for her character. She could not appeal the verdict. Once accused and convicted, she entered a legal category known as the condemned, a status that stripped away all human protections normally afforded even to slaves, transforming her into an object for ritual use. Now, contrast this stark reality with how Egyptian law treated male sexual behavior. A husband could freely have sexual relations with slaves, servants, or prostitutes without facing any legal or lasting social consequences. His wife could not even protest this without risking an accusation of disobedience, which was itself a punishable offense. But if she, the wife, so much as spoke privately with a man not her husband, she could be accused of adultery. The asymmetry was total, deliberate, and ruthlessly efficient. Egyptian legal philosophy rationalized this by stating that men's sexual activities outside marriage did not threaten ma'at, because a man could not be impregnated. Therefore, they reasoned, no confusion of bloodlines could possibly result. Women's sexuality, however, was a vessel, and any activity outside the sanctioned marital bond was a cosmic violation, because any resulting pregnancy could introduce uncertain lineage. This circular reasoning seemed so rational to the all-male jurists that they never stopped to question whether the premise itself was designed from the outset to grant men total control over women's bodies while allowing themselves absolute freedom. After the public spectacle of her mutilation, Hennet Mir is dragged, half-conscious, from the judgment square. She is not taken to a prison, but to a nondescript, heavily guarded building adjacent to the sprawling temple of Karnak. This structure, functional and ominous, was deliberately excluded from all temple complex maps. It exists in a hidden world, 3 full levels below the sun-drenched main courts where pilgrims gathered, accessible only through a single, narrow tunnel that descends at a sharp, ankle-breaking angle deep into the bedrock. The Egyptians called it euphemistically the House of Correction. Modern archaeologists who have cautiously explored its ruins refer to it with stark honesty as simply the adultery chambers. The architecture here is not for glory or the gods, it is for function, and its function is brutal efficiency. A central corridor, low-ceilinged and oppressive, runs like a spine through the darkness. Branching off it are 15 identical small rooms, each no more than 10 feet square, each carved directly from the living stone. There is no decoration, no comfort. Each has a single niche for a small oil lamp that provides more choking smoke than light, and iron rings, cold and unyielding, are set into the walls at precise heights corresponding to a standing woman's wrists and ankles. The ceiling in each cell is exactly 6 feet high, a calculated height that is too low for a person of even average height to stand fully upright, creating a constant, nagging physical discomfort, a persistent reminder of their constrained existence even during the rare moments when they are not being actively punished. There are no windows. No ventilation, beyond what little air sluggishly circulates from the corridor. The temperature is constant year-round, a damp coolness that seeps into the bones and makes bare skin prickle, yet it is never cold enough to provide any numbing relief from the burning brands or throbbing wounds. In rooms identical to this, women served their sentences of purification, their bodies becoming the landscape upon which the lesson of Ma'at was carved. The suffering punishments administered here were not random acts of rage, they followed meticulous protocols specified in legal texts that have survived precisely because they were copied and recopied for judicial training purposes across centuries, a dark curriculum of pain. The standard purification regimen for a convicted adulteress was 15 days, a period divided into 3 distinct 5-day phases, each with its own theological justification and escalating physical severity. This was not mere torture, it was a brutal form of spiritual recalibration, a dark sacrament where pain was the purifying flame. Days 1 through 5, hunger purification. The convicted woman was given measured amounts of water to prevent death from dehydration, but absolutely no food. This was not simple starvation, it was a calculated physiological and psychological manipulation. The hunger served an explicit theological purpose. Egyptian medical texts professed that the organs of digestion were linked directly to the organs of reproduction through invisible channels that carried the body's vital humors. Therefore, starving the digestive system was believed to literally burn away the spiritual pollution that the act of adultery had introduced into her body, purifying the reproductive system from within. But the priests and guards observed a practical dimension that they eagerly exploited. Modern medicine understands that prolonged starvation leads to catastrophic drops in blood sugar, causing profound weakness, confusion, and a deterioration of cognitive function. The body, seeking fuel, begins to consume its own muscle tissue. The Egyptians may not have known the biochemistry, but they knew the result. After 5 days without food, a person's will is broken, their resistance to pain plummets, and their capacity for rebellion or even coherent thought diminishes significantly. A starved woman was a compliant vessel, ready to be filled with whatever lesson came next. Days 6 through 10, pain purification. This phase varied based on the social status of the woman and her alleged partner, but for women like Henet Mir, the wives of ordinary craftsmen and scribes, the standard method was systematic striking of the back, thighs, and the soles of the feet with bundles of hard, sharp reeds. This might sound almost mild compared to flaying or burning, until you understand the devilish technique. Egyptian pain purification was not about unleashing raw, uncontrolled force, but about inflicting cumulative, permanent damage with almost medical precision. The reed strikes were administered 3 times daily, 20 strikes per session, delivered by a specialized priest who had trained for years to hit with a consistent, devastating force, hard enough to cause severe pain and deep tissue damage, but not hard enough to break bones or cause immediate fatal internal bleeding. The same spots on the body were struck repeatedly, day after day, preventing any possibility of healing and creating layers of permanently damaged tissue, of scar upon scar. The medical papyri from Thebes contain chillingly clear instructions for treating women who had survived this reed purification, noting that they typically developed chronic pain conditions that lasted for years and often prevented normal walking. The instructions explicitly command physicians to treat only life-threatening infections, but never to provide any treatment that would allow the damaged tissue to fully heal. The scars and the pain were meant to be lifelong companions, a physical memory that would ache with every step she took for the rest of her days. Days 11 through 15, exposure purification. This final phase before final disposition was a symphony of psychological and physical torment. The convicted woman, already marked and beaten, was displayed publicly in a designated area of the temple courtyard during the most brutal hours of the afternoon sun. She was bound to a wooden frame, positioned so that her mutilated face and branded cheeks were fully visible to every priest, official, and pilgrim entering the sacred complex. Guards stood by to prevent her from moving even an inch into the precious, life-giving shade. Priests would offer her water irregularly, sometimes every hour, sometimes not for 6 agonizing hours, creating a torturous unpredictability that shattered any psychological preparation for relief. The goal was not merely physical suffering from heatstroke and dehydration, but the complete destruction of the spirit through utter humiliation and the crushing weight of uncertainty. Temple records indicate that this exposure phase was often where women finally, completely broke, accepting whatever final punishment was assigned because the mere state of continued existence, under these conditions, had become utterly unbearable. But who were these women, truly? The historical record that has come down to us is written exclusively by the authorities who arrested, tried, and punished them. To understand the full horror, we must work to recover the human reality that lies buried beneath the cold legal categorizations of adulteress and condemned. The women convicted of adultery in ancient Egypt were not a monolith of guilt, even by the standards of their own time. To understand them, one must first understand Egyptian marriage customs, which provide the essential, and often tragic, context. Girls were typically married off at the age of 12 or 13, sometimes even younger, to men chosen entirely by their fathers. These were rarely love matches, they were property arrangements, alliances between families, or ways to settle debts. The girl's consent was not sought, nor was it considered necessary. Once married, she became her husband's legal possession, with fewer rights regarding her own body and life than he had over his own slaves. Some of the convicted women had indeed formed secret relationships with men not their husbands, often relationships based on mutual affection, companionship, and emotional fulfillment, things frequently absent in their arranged, transactional marriages. But a staggering number of others were convicted on evidence that modern legal standards would dismiss as laughably insufficient, or even coercive. Simply speaking to a man at a market, walking alone near a neighbor's house, or singing a little too joyfully while working in a courtyard where a man might overhear could be twisted into seductive behavior by a willing accuser. Egyptian court records from the 19th dynasty document multiple cases where women were convicted based on nothing more than male witnesses testifying that the woman had created the appearance of impropriety. The legal standard had dangerously shifted from "did she commit the act?" to "could someone have thought she might?" And women convicted of creating this mere appearance faced the exact same brutal punishments as women caught in the actual act. Furthermore, a significant number of convictions resulted from false accusations, motivated by factors having nothing to do with sexual morality. A husband who had grown tired of his wife but did not want to return her valuable dowry could simply accuse her of adultery, providing his own slaves as witnesses, and thereby secure both a divorce and the retention of her property. A neighbor who coveted a woman's house or prized possessions could denounce her, knowing that conviction would result in property seizure that might later benefit the accuser. A rejected suitor, bitter and vengeful, could claim the woman had promised herself to him and then betrayed him with her husband, creatively framing a legitimate marriage as an act of adultery. Understanding this complex and often sinister context is essential, because it reveals that we are not simply examining ancient attitudes towards sexual morality. We are pulling back the curtain on how legal systems can be deliberately constructed to give a veneer of institutional legitimacy to systematic male control and violence against women. We are seeing how sophisticated theological frameworks can be weaponized to transform profound cruelty into righteous duty. We are witnessing how entire civilizations can convince themselves that brutality is a necessary price to pay for order. After the 15 days of purification were complete, the legal machine moved to its final, irrevocable stage, disposition. This was the judgment that determined the ultimate fate of the woman's body and, according to their beliefs, her eternal soul. Egyptian law recognized three primary categories of final punishment, each deemed appropriate for different circumstances and social standings. First, lifelong temple servitude. This was considered the least severe option, typically reserved for women of lower social standing or whose cases lacked major aggravating factors. Those assigned this fate were transferred from the House of Correction to the main temple complexes, where they served as the very lowest category of worker, the untouchables of the sacred world. Their duties were all those considered deeply polluting: cleaning latrines, removing ritual waste, preparing the bodies of the lowest classes for mummification. They lived in windowless cells attached to storage areas, forbidden to speak unless directly addressed by a priest. Their heads were kept permanently shaved. Their bodies, already branded, were marked with the adultery symbol refreshed annually to prevent it from fading. They wore only coarse gray linen, the color of death and mourning, a walking funeral shroud. Most critically of all, they were forbidden from participating in any religious rituals or making any preparations for the afterlife. They could not commission mortuary texts, purchase canopic jars, or secure tomb space. When they eventually died, their bodies were not mummified, but hastily wrapped in plain linen and dumped into unmarked, shallow graves in the desert. Egyptian theology was clear: without the proper spells and rituals, the soul could not navigate the dangers of the afterlife and would be condemned to wander for eternity in the void beyond Ma'at. This was, therefore, not just a life sentence, but an eternal one. Second, exile to the mines. This was a death sentence, plain and simple, though it was often a slow and gruesome one. Egypt's gold and copper mines in the eastern desert and Sinai were places of legendary horror, operated almost entirely by convicted criminals. Women sentenced to the mines were chained together in coffles and force-marched across hundreds of miles of blistering desert. The journey itself killed a significant portion of them, their bodies left for scavengers where they fell. Those who survived the march entered a world that defies modern comprehension. The mines were narrow, unstable tunnels dug deep into the earth, where temperatures regularly soared past 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Workers labored naked, as clothing would disintegrate. They were given minimal water and a thin barley paste, just enough to keep their weakened bodies functioning. The work involved crawling on hands and knees through suffocatingly tight spaces, chipping at rock faces in near-total darkness, breathing air thick with rock dust that shredded the lungs. They worked until they collapsed from heatstroke, exhaustion, or injury. If they did not recover within a few days, they were dragged out and buried in mass graves. Archaeological evidence from these burial sites reveals skeletons racked with the signs of extreme trauma, malnutrition, and repetitive stress injuries, with most victims dying within 18 months of their arrival. Third, public execution. This was reserved for the most high-profile cases, women of noble or royal blood, or cases where the adultery created a major political scandal that required a definitive, public response. The standard method was ritual drowning in the Nile while sewn into a weighted sack. This method was chosen for its chilling efficiency and profound theological implications. The Nile was the sacred lifeblood of Egypt, personified by the god Hapi, who was believed to personally judge those cast into his waters. A quickly sinking sack signified Hapi's acceptance of the offering as just. The weights ensured the body would never be recovered for proper burial, and drowning was considered fitting for an adulteress because it filled the lungs, the seat of the breath and spirit, with the chaotic waters of Nun, preventing her soul from breathing in the afterlife. These executions were public spectacles held at dawn. The condemned woman was sewn into a linen sack with heavy stones, a priest recited a condemnation, and then she was cast into the middle of the river from a boat. Observers' accounts sometimes noted the sack twitching as it sank, or bubbles rising to the surface for minutes afterward, haunting details that suggested a conscious, struggling end in the dark, cold depths. The tragedy of Hennet Mir lies not just in her punishment, but in the profound injustice of her conviction. Her ordeal began not with an act of passion, but with a lie born of spite. Her accuser was her husband's own younger brother, a man named Amenhotep. For 2 years, Amenhotep had propositioned Hennet Mir, and for 2 years, she had firmly and fearfully rejected his advances. Humiliated and vengeful, Amenhotep orchestrated her destruction. He testified before the local judges that he had personally witnessed her meeting secretly with a kind-hearted potter named Nakht. He provided specific, fabricated dates and times. He coerced his own personal slave, through threats and beatings, into testifying that he had delivered messages between them. As his masterstroke, he presented a piece of pottery with a love poem scratched onto it, claiming he had discovered it hidden in her clothing chest. In reality, he had copied the poem himself from a common song. The evidence was a complete fabrication. The meetings had never happened. The slave was lying under duress. The pottery shard was a forgery. But under Egyptian law, the physical evidence and the testimony of 2 male witnesses, Amenhotep and his slave, was more than sufficient for a conviction. Hennet Mir was not permitted to speak in her own defense. Nakht the potter was not even called as a witness. Instead, he was arrested separately after her conviction and swiftly executed for adultery with a single, merciful sword stroke, a stark illustration of the gender disparity in punishment. The true tragedy deepened when her husband, Jyoti, learned what his brother had done. He was horrified. He rushed to the judges, attempting to withdraw the accusation and testify to his wife's certain innocence. But Egyptian legal procedure was a trap that snapped shut. The law did not permit the withdrawal of an adultery accusation once formal charges had been filed. The judges explained to the distraught Jyoti that allowing withdrawals would encourage a flood of false accusations, as accusers would face no consequences. They argued that protecting the terrifying, inviolable integrity of the legal process was more important than correcting a potential individual wrong. To their minds, the system's infallibility had to be maintained, even if it meant sacrificing the innocent. Jyoti's passionate testimony was ruled inadmissible because, as her husband, he was deemed to have a conflict of interest. The legal machine had achieved a perfect, horrifying circularity. Hennet Mir completed her 15 days of purification. She endured the destruction of her nose, the branding of her cheeks, the relentless beating of her body until walking was a fresh agony with every step. She then began her sentence of lifelong temple servitude. For 9 long years, she lived in a windowless cell, performing her polluted duties, watching as other condemned women arrived, suffered, and died around her. Her children grew up believing the official story that she had died when they were young. Their father, broken and pragmatic, remarried 3 years after her conviction, to a younger woman selected for him by the very brother, Amenhotep, who had destroyed his first family. The children were raised by this stepmother and were forbidden from ever mentioning their birth mother's name. Within a decade, the younger ones had no memory of her. The oldest held on to fleeting, fragmented memories of a woman who sang while grinding grain, but these eventually faded into the hazy, uncertain quality of half-remembered dreams. Hennet Mir died in her 31st year. Her body was discovered in a remote service corridor, where she had collapsed while carrying jars of human waste for disposal. The temple physician listed the cause of death as the weakness of the heart, a common euphemism for any death they could not, or would not, specifically diagnose. She was wrapped in a single sheet of plain, unbleached linen and carried out to the desert beyond the temple walls. There, she was placed in an unmarked, sandy grave. No rituals were performed. No prayers were uttered for her soul's journey. Her name was systematically chiseled from family records. She was erased. We know her story today only because a single, passionate protest text written by her husband, Jyoti, was preserved by sheer chance in an archive of disputed legal cases. His text argued that the legal system was fundamentally flawed and desperately needed reforms to protect the innocent. His arguments were reviewed by the temple authorities and formally rejected. The system had spoken. It was more important to punish every potential guilty party than to protect a few innocent ones. The techniques for controlling female sexuality, perfected in the dust of ancient Egypt, did not vanish with the fall of the pharaohs. They evolved, they adapted, they spread across continents and centuries, and they persist in forms we must have the courage to recognize today. The fundamental logic that underpinned Egyptian adultery law, that women's bodies are communal property subject to male regulation, and that female sexual autonomy is a dangerous threat to social order, has proven to be one of history's most resilient and destructive viruses. Roman law, which would form the bedrock of Western legal tradition, adapted Egyptian punishments directly. The Justinian Code, compiled in the 6th century CE, drew explicit inspiration from Egyptian precedent in treating adultery as primarily a female crime, punishable by public humiliation and bodily mutilation. Medieval European law continued this dark tradition for the next 1,000 years. Women convicted of adultery faced brandings, public whippings at the town pillory, and confinement in Magdalene laundries and convents under intentionally brutal conditions, all practices directly traceable to the models developed along the Nile. The very concept of honor killings, where families murder female relatives accused of sexual impropriety, emerges from this ancient legal tradition that treated female purity not as a personal virtue, but as a family asset, whose damage was seen as a theft that justified a violent, righteous response. Let us be clear and look at the modern world with unflinching eyes. As of 2025, a sobering 20 countries still maintain laws that specifically criminalize adultery. In 12 of those nations, the penalty applies exclusively to women, or is applied with drastically more severity to women than to men, directly replicating the Egyptian gender asymmetry. In 8 countries, women can still be legally sentenced to death by stoning for adultery, a method that deliberately prolongs suffering and involves the community in the act of punishment, just as Egyptian exposure purification required public witness. In 15 countries, laws still explicitly excuse or significantly reduce penalties for men who kill female relatives accused of dishonoring their family. These honor-killing provisions are the direct descendants of legal principles first articulated in ancient Egyptian law codes. Worldwide, human rights organizations estimate that at least 5,000 women are killed each year in honor-based violence, with the true number likely far higher due to systematic underreporting. Each one of these killings follows the same brutal logic that condemned Hennet Mir. A woman violated a sexual norm, her violation threatened the family's or community's status, therefore, her death was necessary to restore that status. The specifics of the culture may differ, but the underlying pattern of control and punishment has remained constant for 3,000 years. Hennet Mir was a real person. She was a mother who knew the unique weight of a sleeping child in her arms. She was a skilled weaver whose hands created beauty and whose textiles were sought after in the market. She was a woman with friends, with laughter, with private dreams for her children's future. All of it, every song, every smile, every dream, was stolen by a legal machine that valued its own procedures more than her truth, that saw her body as a canvas for a public lesson and her life as disposable. We remember her now, and the countless thousands of unnamed others, not to dwell morbidly on the past, but because they were real. Their suffering was real. And our refusal to forget them, to let them be erased a second time by the sands of historical neglect, is the minimum respect we owe to them. Their stories are not ancient history, they are a warning. They matter because the patterns they reveal are not locked in the past. They are alive in courtrooms, in villages, and in homes across the world today. Recognizing these age-old patterns of gendered violence is the first, and most crucial, step toward finally, definitively, breaking them.